There's something Carl Jung discovered about human suffering that completely changes how you understand the hardest years of your life. The people who endure the deepest pain don't just survive it. They don't simply make it through. They undergo a psychological transformation that most human beings will never experience. Jung found that intense psychological suffering, when it is fully faced and consciously lived through, does not merely scar you. It reorganizes your inner world. It dismantles who you were and begins constructing someone entirely new. And if you've lived through years that shattered your sense of identity, years that isolated you, years that forced you to question everything you thought you knew, Jung would not say you were unlucky. He would say you were being initiated. Initiated into a level of awareness that cannot be reached through comfort. Jung devoted his life to studying what he called the process of individuation, the painful journey of becoming psychologically whole, and what he discovered was unsettling. Every person who reached deep psychological maturity passed through a period of inner darkness, without exception, not as a mistake, not as a detour, but as a requirement, which means your hardest years were not random. They were formative. They were shaping you for something you may not yet be able to see. And what comes next will begin to reveal why you had to walk through everything you did. Carl Jung discovered something unsettling about the human psyche that most people never realize, and that is that the psyche does not evolve through happiness, safety, or comfort. It evolves through crisis. Real psychological growth begins at the moment your old identity can no longer contain your inner reality. This is why your hardest years did not simply feel painful. They felt disorienting, destabilizing, and identity-shattering. You were not just losing situations, relationships, or stability. You were losing versions of yourself. Jung observed that when a person enters a true transformation, the first phase always looks like collapse. The structures that once held their personality together begin to dissolve. The beliefs that once guided them stop working. The goals that once motivated them start to feel empty, and the ego interprets this as failure. But from a deeper psychological perspective, something very different is happening. The psyche is attempting to reorganize itself at a higher level of complexity. In simple terms, the person you were was too small for the person you are becoming. And nature's solution to this problem is not gentle. It does not politely ask you to grow. It creates pressure until growth becomes unavoidable. This is why Jung said that neurosis, depression, and existential crisis often appear right before major psychological development. They are signals that the old personality structure is no longer viable. If you've wondered why your suffering felt so internal, so invisible, so difficult to explain to others, it's because this was not situational pain alone. It was structural pain. Your inner world was being dismantled and reassembled. And the most important thing Jung discovered is that this process cannot be skipped. There is no shortcut to depth. There is no painless route to wholeness. Every human being who eventually develops strong intuition, emotional regulation, psychological independence, and inner authority has passed through a period where they felt lost, broken, and disoriented. The difference is that most people never allow this process to complete. They panic. They cling to distractions. They numb themselves. They rush to rebuild a false version of who they were just to escape the discomfort. And this creates lifelong stagnation. But you didn't fully escape. Even if you tried at times, something in you kept pulling you inward. Something in you kept refusing shallow solutions. Something in you sensed that returning to who you used to be was not possible. That inner tension you felt, the feeling of being suspended between who you were and who you don't yet understand, is a classic sign of individuation in motion. Jung described this phase as a symbolic death. Not physical death, but psychological death. The death of outdated identities, false self-images, and borrowed beliefs. And death, even symbolic death, feels terrifying to the ego. The ego experiences it as annihilation, but the psyche experiences it as necessary pruning. Imagine a forest where old trees must fall, so that sunlight can reach the ground and allow new growth. From the tree's perspective, falling is destruction. From nature's perspective, falling is regeneration. Your psyche operates the same way. When your old identity collapsed, it was not because you failed. It was because that identity had reached its developmental limit, could not take you further. This is why your suffering felt prolonged. Quick pain is usually situational. Deep pain is evolutionary. It lingers because it is reshaping foundational layers of personality. You were not being punished by life. You were not being singled out. You were undergoing psychological reorganization. Jung found that people in this phase often feel older than their age, more serious than their peers, less interested in superficial pursuits, and strangely detached from conventional ambitions. This is not because something is wrong with them. It is because their psyche has shifted from external orientation to internal orientation. Instead of asking, "How do I succeed?" they begin unconsciously asking, "Who am I?" And this question destabilizes everything. Careers lose meaning. Relationships feel hollow. Social games feel exhausting. Because the psyche is no longer satisfied with surface-level identity. It wants essence. And essence cannot be built on borrowed roles. This is also why your hardest years likely involved isolation, either physically or emotionally. Jung observed that individuation often pulls people away from the collective. Not permanently, but temporarily. Because you cannot hear your own psyche clearly while drowning in other people's expectations. Solitude becomes the laboratory where the new self begins forming. Even if you didn't choose isolation, even if it came through loss, rejection, or withdrawal, it served the same function. It forced your attention inward. It forced you to confront yourself without constant distraction. And this is where something important begins to happen. You start noticing patterns. You start recognizing wounds. You start seeing how much of your previous life was driven by fear, approval-seeking, or unconscious conditioning. This realization hurts, because it means you were not as free as you thought. But it is also empowering, because awareness is the first step toward real autonomy. Jung believed that the moment a person becomes conscious of their unconscious patterns, they are no longer fully controlled by them. And this is one of the first hidden gifts your suffering gave you. You began to see. You began to perceive beneath the surface. You began to sense when something was false, misaligned, or empty, even if you couldn't yet articulate why. That sensitivity, that heightened perception, that discomfort with superficiality, is not weakness. It is the early formation of psychological depth. And depth is the foundation of everything that comes next. One of the most difficult truths Jung uncovered is that suffering does not automatically make people wiser. Many people suffer and become bitter, rigid, resentful, or emotionally frozen. But a small percentage of people suffer and begin to change in a completely different direction. They become more perceptive, more inwardly stable, more aware of themselves and others. The difference, Jung observed, is not how much pain a person experiences. It is their relationship to the pain. People who constantly flee their suffering remain psychologically shallow, even if their lives look successful on the outside. But people who are forced to sit with their suffering, who cannot outrun it, who have nowhere left to hide, begin developing an inner capacity that is extremely rare. They develop the ability to remain conscious inside discomfort. This is not a glamorous ability. It does not feel empowering at first. Feels heavy, feels lonely, feels exhausting, but it is one of the most powerful psychological skills a human being can acquire. Because the person who can stay present inside pain without collapsing or escaping gains access to deeper layers of the psyche. Jung called these deeper layers the unconscious. And within the unconscious live both the shadow and the undeveloped potentials of the personality. The shadow is not just your darkness. It is everything you were never allowed to become. It is your suppressed anger, your suppressed strength, your unexpressed needs, your buried desires, your denied boundaries. For many people, these parts remain buried for their entire lives. But intense suffering cracks open the psyche. It weakens the rigid control of the ego. And when that control weakens, the shadow begins to surface. This is why your hardest years may have included emotional volatility, intrusive thoughts, unexpected rage, grief that felt bottomless, or sudden realizations about yourself that were uncomfortable. You were not becoming worse. You were becoming more honest. Parts of you that had been silenced were demanding recognition. Jung believed that psychological health does not mean eliminating the shadow. It means integrating it. Integration means you become aware of these hidden parts, you stop projecting them onto others, and you learn how to consciously relate to them. This is a long, uncomfortable process, but it produces a person who is no longer naive about themselves. And a person who is not naive about themselves cannot easily be manipulated, gaslit, or controlled. This is another hidden gift of your suffering. You likely learned, through painful experiences, that not everyone is who they present themselves to be. You learned that charm does not equal integrity. You learned that promises do not equal character. You learned that words and actions often diverge. These realizations are disillusioning. They can make the world feel darker. But Jung would say they are actually bringing you closer to reality. Illusion is comforting. Reality is sobering. But only reality gives you true power. As your illusions about others collapsed, your illusions about yourself likely collapsed too. You may have realized how often you abandoned your own needs, how often you tolerated mistreatment, how often you silenced your intuition to keep peace. These realizations hurt because they confront you with your own participation in your suffering. But they also return agency to you. If you were not merely a victim of fate, if you had patterns that contributed to your pain, then you also have the capacity to change those patterns. This is where real empowerment begins. Not with positive thinking, not with motivational slogans, but with brutal self-honesty. Jung believed that people who integrate their shadow gradually develop what he called psychological solidity. They become harder to destabilize. Not because nothing affects them, but because they understand themselves well enough to navigate inner turbulence. They know their triggers. They recognize their emotional patterns. They are less frightened by their own darkness. And this internal familiarity creates a strange kind of calm. You may have noticed this in yourself. You may not feel happy all the time, but you are probably more grounded than you used to be. You have likely endured emotional states that once would have destroyed you, and now you survive them. That is not numbness. That is increased capacity. Your nervous system has expanded its tolerance. Your psyche has learned that it can survive intensity. This is not something comfort teaches. This is something only repeated confrontation with difficulty can teach. Jung understood this as a form of inner strengthening. The psyche builds muscle the same way the body does, through resistance, through strain, through recovery. And just as physical strength is invisible to others unless tested, psychological strength often goes unnoticed. People may not see how much you can carry, but you know how many nights you survived. You know how many internal battles you fought in silence. You know how many times you wanted to give up and didn't. That knowledge quietly changes how you move through the world. You may not consciously think, I am strong. But somewhere deep inside, you know that you are capable of surviving what once seemed unsurvivable. And that knowing becomes the foundation for everything that follows. As this inner strength develops, something else begins to emerge that Jung considered one of the most important outcomes of deep suffering. A shift from external authority to internal authority. Earlier in life, most people unconsciously organize themselves around outside structures. They look to society, family, culture, religion, or peer groups to tell them who they should be, what they should want, and how they should live. This is normal. It is part of early psychological development. But prolonged suffering tends to break these external reference points. When you followed the rules and still suffered. When you did the right things and still lost. When you trusted authority figures and were still betrayed. The belief that external systems will save you slowly collapses. At first, this collapse feels terrifying, because the illusion of external protection is comforting. But its loss forces the psyche to turn inward, and inward is where real authority is born. Jung believed that individuation only truly begins when a person stops unconsciously outsourcing their identity. When they stop asking, who do I need to be accepted? And start asking, who am I when no one is watching? Your hardest years likely pushed you into this question whether you wanted it or not. You may have felt lost, directionless, unmoored. But underneath that confusion, a deeper realignment was occurring. You were slowly being disconnected from false motivations, from chasing approval, from living according to other people's expectations, from building a life that looked acceptable but felt empty. This disconnection is painful because it strips away certainty before it provides replacement meaning. It is like being forced to release the shore before you can see land on the other side. But Jung understood that this is the only way a person ever discovers their authentic values. Not values inherited from parents, not values absorbed from culture, but values that arise organically from one's own nature. This process takes time because authenticity cannot be downloaded. It must be uncovered, layer by layer, through lived experience, through trial and error, through disillusionment, through noticing what drains you and what quietly sustains you, through paying attention to what feels false and what feels strangely alive. You may not yet have language for your true direction, but you probably already sense what is no longer right for you. That alone is significant progress. Many people spend their entire lives ignoring that signal. Another shift that often happens during this stage is a deepening relationship with solitude. Not necessarily because you want to be alone, but because superficial interaction becomes intolerable. Small talk feels empty. Performative socializing feels exhausting. You may crave fewer connections but more honest ones. Jung saw this as a sign of descending from persona-level living into soul-level living. The persona is the mask you wear to function in society. The soul is the private inner reality that contains your real emotional and psychological life. Your suffering likely weakened your attachment to your persona. You stopped caring as much about appearances. You became less interested in impressing, more interested in being real. This is not social dysfunction. It is psychological maturation. A person who no longer needs constant validation is beginning to root themselves internally. And internal rooting changes everything. It means your sense of worth is no longer entirely dependent on external feedback. You may still desire connection. You may still feel loneliness, but you are less willing to betray yourself to avoid it. This is a crucial threshold. Jung believed that once a person crosses this threshold, they cannot fully return to unconscious living. They have tasted a different way of existing, a way that is quieter, heavier, but far more honest. And honesty, even when uncomfortable, creates alignment. Alignment between your inner world and your outer choices. That alignment is the beginning of a life that feels like it belongs to you, not a life that merely looks acceptable to others. And this shift, although subtle, is one of the clearest signs that your suffering has already begun paying off, even if you cannot yet see the final form it will take. As this inner alignment strengthens, Jung observed another transformation that often surprises people: a growing comfort with uncertainty. Earlier in life, most people crave predictability. They want clear timelines, guaranteed outcomes, and stable narratives about where their life is headed. This desire is not shallow. It is rooted in the ego's need for control. The ego feels safe when it can label, categorize, and forecast. But your hardest years probably destroyed your ability to rely on predictable stories. You made plans that collapsed. You trusted paths that disappeared. You invested energy into futures that never materialized. At first, this feels cruel. But psychologically, something important is happening. The psyche is being trained to operate without false certainty. Jung believed that genuine growth requires learning to live inside open-endedness, because reality itself is fluid. When a person becomes too attached to fixed identities and rigid expectations, they become brittle. They break easily when life deviates from the script. But a person who has repeatedly survived unpredictability develops flexibility. They learn that not knowing does not equal danger. They learn that emptiness is not always absence. Sometimes it is space. Space for something new to emerge. This is why you may now feel less desperate to control outcomes than you once did. You still care. You still desire stability. But you are no longer clinging with the same frantic intensity. And this shift quietly increases your power. Because the person who can remain grounded while unsure has an advantage in almost every domain of life. They are harder to intimidate, harder to manipulate, harder to destabilize. Jung saw this as a form of psychological sovereignty. You are no longer organized entirely around external circumstances. Your center of gravity has moved inward. Another capacity that begins to emerge during this stage is symbolic perception. Instead of experiencing events only at surface level, you begin sensing underlying patterns. You notice repeating themes in relationships. You see cycles in your behavior. You recognize how certain types of situations keep appearing until a lesson is integrated. Jung believed this pattern recognition is a natural function of a more conscious psyche. It means you are starting to perceive life as a meaningful process rather than a random sequence of accidents. This does not mean you romanticize suffering. It does not mean you believe everything happens for a good reason. It means you begin asking different questions. Not why is this happening to me? But what is this showing me? That shift alone changes how you relate to difficulty. You stop seeing yourself solely as a victim of circumstance and start recognizing yourself as a participant in an unfolding psychological journey. This does not remove pain, but it adds coherence, and coherence reduces despair. Jung found that people who develop this symbolic lens often feel called toward depth-oriented pursuits. They may not consciously label it this way, but they are drawn to psychology, philosophy, art, spirituality, writing, or any domain that explores the inner world. Not because it is trendy, but because their psyche has been expanded into those territories through lived experience. You may notice that surface-level entertainment no longer satisfies you in the same way. You crave material that resonates with your inner complexity. This is another sign of maturation. Your inner world has become richer, and a richer inner world requires richer input. There is also a growing sensitivity to truth. You become less tolerant of self-deception, less patient with half-truths, less willing to participate in dynamics that feel fundamentally dishonest. This can make life feel more difficult at times, because truth is often inconvenient, but it also makes life cleaner. You waste less energy on situations that are misaligned. You disengage faster from what feels wrong. You may still struggle with attachment. You may still hesitate, but you see more clearly than before. Jung believed that clarity is not loud. It is quiet. It does not announce itself with confidence. It simply knows. And that quiet knowing is one of the most valuable inner resources a human being can possess. Cannot be given. Cannot be taught directly. It is earned through confrontation with reality, through disappointment, through grief, through disillusionment, through surviving experiences that shatter naive assumptions. In other words, through exactly the kind of years you have already lived. And this means something important. You are no longer in the phase of being shaped. You are entering the phase of application. The raw material forged through your hardest years is slowly organizing into usable form. You may not yet know what you will use it for, but the capacities are there, waiting. At a certain point in this journey, Jung observed that something subtle but irreversible happens. You stop measuring your life primarily by comparison. Earlier versions of you may have constantly checked where you stood relative to others. Who is ahead? Who is behind? Who is winning? Who is falling behind? But prolonged inner transformation slowly dissolves this framework. Not because you suddenly feel superior, and not because you stop caring about growth, but because you begin to recognize that your life is unfolding according to a different architecture, a different timetable, a different logic. You realize that many people who appear ahead are running on borrowed identities. They are fulfilling scripts that were handed to them. And many people who appear behind are actually incubating something that has not yet revealed its form. You begin to sense that your path was never meant to look conventional. This recognition brings an unexpected calm. Not a euphoric happiness, but a grounded acceptance. You stop trying to force yourself into timelines that were not designed for you. You stop panicking about being late, because you realize that depth matures differently than surface success. Jung believed that when a person has undergone deep individuation, their life begins organizing around meaning rather than validation. They become less motivated by applause and more motivated by inner resonance. They start asking, does this feel true? Instead of, does this look impressive? And this question quietly reshapes everything. The work you are drawn toward begins to shift. You may feel pulled toward roles that involve guiding, supporting, creating, healing, teaching, building, or illuminating. Not necessarily in grand public ways, often in small, precise human ways. Jung called these vocations of depth. They are not about status. They are about function. They are the natural expression of a psyche that has traveled into dark territory and returned with awareness. You are able to sit with complexity without needing to reduce it. You can hold contradictory truths without collapsing. You can be present with suffering without immediately trying to fix it. These capacities make you quietly invaluable, even if no one has yet recognized it, even if you yourself have not fully recognized it. Another change that often appears is a deepening sense of self-respect. Not arrogance, not grandiosity, but a quiet boundary. You become less willing to abandon yourself, less willing to tolerate environments that require constant self-betrayal, less willing to shrink your truth to keep others comfortable. This may initially reduce your circle. Some people may drift away. Some dynamics may collapse. But what replaces them is cleaner, more honest, more sustainable. Jung understood this as alignment between the inner and outer world. And alignment produces a particular kind of strength. A strength that does not need to dominate. A strength that does not need to prove. A strength that simply stands. You may still have doubts. You may still have days where you feel behind, uncertain, or tired. That does not mean the process has failed. It means you are human. But underneath those fluctuations, something fundamental has changed. You are no longer the person you were before your hardest years began. You see more. You sense more. You understand more. You can carry more. And this means the life that is forming ahead of you will require a version of you that only suffering could create. Jung would tell you this directly. You were not broken by your hardest years. You were forged. You were shaped into someone capable of walking a path that most people would not survive. The payoff is not a single dramatic moment. It is a gradual unfolding into a life that feels internally coherent. A life where your actions reflect your inner truth. A life where your presence itself has weight. A life that belongs to you. And if you are still here, still searching, still breathing, still trying to understand yourself, that is proof that the transformation is working. You are closer than you think. If this message resonated with you, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and stay with us for more content exploring depth psychology, transformation, and the hidden architecture of the human psyche.